The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Eldoria Palace as Captain Marcus Whitmore adjusted his ceremonial uniform one final time. For 15 years, he had served as the personal guard to King Edmund VII, maintaining his silence through countless royal scandals, political machinations, and family disputes. But today would be different. Today, the weight of what he knew had become too heavy to bear. The High Court of Eldoria buzzed with anticipation as nobles, journalists, and curious citizens filled every available seat. The case before them seemed routine enough, a dispute over royal inheritance laws that had been brewing for months. Queen Isabella, King Edmund's second wife, sat regally in the royal section, her emerald dress catching the light from the tall windows. Her dark hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and her composed expression revealed nothing of the storm that was about to break around her. King Edmund sat beside her, his weathered face showing the strain of recent months. At 62, he had ruled Eldoria for over 2 decades, but the lines around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. He glanced occasionally at his wife, unaware that their carefully constructed world was about to crumble. Marcus stood at attention near the witness stand, his mind racing through the events that had led him to this moment. It had started 3 months ago with an overheard conversation in the Queen's private study. He had been conducting a routine security check when voices from behind the heavy oak door stopped him in his tracks. The Queen's voice, usually so controlled and measured, carried an edge of desperation he had never heard before. The documents must never surface, she had said to someone Marcus couldn't see through the partially open door. If anyone discovers what really happened during the succession crisis, everything we've built will be destroyed. Marcus had frozen, his hand still on the door handle. In his 15 years of service, he had learned to be invisible, to hear without listening, to see without observing. But this conversation was different. The Queen was discussing something that could shake the very foundations of the kingdom. The voice that responded was familiar: Lord Chancellor Harrison Vale, the Queen's most trusted advisor and, according to palace rumors, something much more than that. The evidence is secure, Your Majesty. No one will ever know that Prince Alexander's death wasn't the accident we claimed it to be. Marcus felt his blood run cold. Prince Alexander had been King Edmund's eldest son from his first marriage, the rightful heir to the throne. His death in a hunting accident 5 years ago had cleared the path for Queen Isabella's influence over the kingdom and set the stage for her own children to inherit the crown. The official investigation had concluded it was a tragic mishap, a rifle malfunction that had taken the life of the beloved prince. But now, hearing the Queen's words, Marcus realized the truth was far darker. He had remained frozen outside the door as the conversation continued, each word burning itself into his memory. Edmund still grieves for his son, the Queen had continued. Sometimes I catch him looking at Alexander's portrait with such pain in his eyes. He has no idea how close he came to discovering our arrangement. The king must never know, Lord Vale had replied firmly. Your position as queen, our plans for Prince William's succession, the very stability of the realm depends on this secret remaining buried. Prince William was Queen Isabella's 16-year-old son from her previous marriage, whom King Edmund had legally adopted. With Prince Alexander gone, William stood to inherit the throne, despite having no blood connection to the royal line. Marcus had carefully backed away from the door that day, his mind reeling from what he had heard. For weeks afterward, he had tried to convince himself that he had misunderstood, that there was some innocent explanation for the Queen's words. But, as he observed the royal family more closely, the pieces began to fall into place. He noticed how Queen Isabella would sometimes smile when King Edmund spoke fondly of his deceased son, a smile that never quite reached her eyes. He observed the subtle ways Lord Vale would steer conversations away from any topic that might lead to questions about Prince Alexander's death. Most disturbing of all, he began to see how the Queen manipulated the king's grief, using his pain over his son's loss to maintain her influence over royal decisions. The final straw had come just 2 weeks ago. While conducting a security sweep of Lord Vale's office, Marcus had discovered a hidden compartment behind a bookshelf. Inside was a leather portfolio containing documents that made his blood freeze. There were detailed plans for Prince Alexander's accident, communications with the huntsman who had been paid to tamper with the rifle, and, most damning of all, a letter in Queen Isabella's own handwriting outlining the benefits of eliminating the true heir to the throne. Marcus had carefully photographed the documents before replacing them exactly as he had found them. That night, he had lain awake staring at the ceiling, wrestling with a decision that would change everything. His oath was to protect the royal family, but which royal family? The king who trusted him implicitly, or the queen who had committed the ultimate betrayal? The sound of the court clerk calling for order brought Marcus back to the present moment. The inheritance case was proceeding as expected, with lawyers droning on about centuries-old laws and precedents. But Marcus knew that within the hour, everything would change. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, consulting with legal experts outside the palace, ensuring that his evidence would be presented in the most effective way possible. He had even reached out secretly to Prince Alexander's close friends and former tutors, gathering additional testimony about the prince's character and his relationship with his stepmother. What Marcus had discovered painted a picture of a young man who had grown increasingly suspicious of Queen Isabella's motives in the months before his death. Prince Alexander had confided to his former tutor, Professor Helena Ashford, that he believed his stepmother was trying to undermine his relationship with his father. He had even begun to suspect that she was involved in several questionable financial dealings that benefited her family's business interests. Alexander was planning to confront his father about his suspicions, Professor Ashford had told Marcus during their clandestine meeting. He scheduled a private audience with the king for the week following his death. He never got the chance. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Marcus was convinced that Queen Isabella had learned of Prince Alexander's plans and acted quickly to silence him permanently. Now, as he stood in the courtroom, Marcus could feel the weight of the evidence in his jacket pocket. The photographs, the witness statements, the timeline he had carefully constructed, all of it pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Queen Isabella and Lord Vale had orchestrated the murder of the rightful heir to the throne. The current case was drawing to a close, and Marcus knew his moment was approaching. He had requested permission to address the court on a matter of urgent national importance, a right granted to senior members of the royal guard under ancient laws that were rarely invoked. The judge had agreed, though she clearly expected some routine security announcement. Queen Isabella sat perfectly still, occasionally whispering to Lord Vale, who sat just behind the royal section. King Edmund appeared lost in thought, probably contemplating the legal implications of the inheritance case for his kingdom. Neither of them had any idea that their world was about to be turned upside down. Marcus thought about his family, his wife Sarah and their two young children who were at home, unaware that their father was about to become the most famous whistleblower in the kingdom's history. He had prepared them as much as he could without revealing the full truth, telling them only that he might need to travel for work unexpectedly in the coming weeks. The truth was, Marcus had no idea what would happen after he revealed his evidence. Would he be arrested for treason? Would the royal family close ranks to protect themselves? Would the people of Eldoria even believe such a shocking accusation against their beloved queen? But, as he looked at King Edmund's trusting face, Marcus knew he had no choice. The king deserved to know the truth about his son's death, no matter how much it would hurt. The kingdom deserved to know that their future ruler had been chosen through murder rather than birthright. The judge was calling for final arguments in the inheritance case. Soon, very soon, it would be Marcus's turn to speak. His heart pounded as he mentally rehearsed the words he had practiced 100 times. There would be no going back after this moment. Queen Isabella turned slightly in her seat, her eyes briefly meeting Marcus's. For just an instant, he thought he saw a flicker of something, suspicion, perhaps, or concern. But, then, her expression returned to its usual composed mask, and she turned her attention back to the proceedings. Marcus gripped the evidence tighter and, prepared to change the course of history, the moment arrived with startling suddenness. Judge Catherine Morehouse looked up from her notes and addressed the court with formal precision. Before we conclude today's proceedings, Captain Marcus Whitmore of the Royal Guard has requested to address this court on a matter of urgent national importance. Captain Whitmore, you may proceed. Marcus felt every eye in the courtroom turn toward him as he stepped forward. The whispers died to absolute silence, creating an atmosphere so tense it seemed to crackle with electricity. He could feel Queen Isabella's gaze boring into him, and, when he glanced in her direction, her face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. Your Honor, Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber, I come before this court today not as a guard, but as a citizen of Eldoria with evidence of a crime that strikes at the very heart of our monarchy. King Edmund straightened in his chair, his brow furrowing with confusion. Lord Vale leaned forward, his hand gripping the back of the bench so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Queen Isabella remained motionless, but Marcus could see the rapid rise and fall of her chest beneath her emerald dress. For 15 years, I have served our royal family with loyalty and discretion. I have kept their secrets, protected their privacy, and sworn to defend them with my life if necessary. But loyalty to the crown must supersede loyalty to any individual, even when that individual wears the crown itself. Marcus reached into his jacket and withdrew the leather portfolio containing the evidence he had so carefully assembled. The gesture was deliberate, theatrical even, and it sent a ripple of anticipation through the packed courtroom. 3 months ago, I became aware of information that suggested Prince Alexander's death 5 years ago was not the hunting accident we were told it was. As my duty demanded, I investigated these claims thoroughly before bringing them to light. The gasp that went through the courtroom was audible. King Edmund half rose from his seat, his face a mask of shock and confusion. What are you saying, Marcus? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the silent chamber. Marcus turned to face his sovereign, the man he had served faithfully for so many years, and felt his heart break at what he was about to reveal. Your Majesty, I have evidence that Prince Alexander was murdered to prevent him from exposing corruption within the royal household and to clear the path for an alternative succession. The explosion of noise that followed was immediate and overwhelming. Reporters shouted questions, nobles gasped and whispered frantically to one another, and court officials called for order. But, through it all, Marcus kept his eyes fixed on King Edmund's face, watching as the color drained from his features and his hands began to tremble. Judge Morehouse banged her gavel repeatedly, finally, restoring a semblance of order. This is highly irregular, Captain Whitmore. These are extremely serious accusations that should properly be brought before a criminal court, not during civil proceedings. Your Honor, with respect, the evidence I possess implicates individuals who might otherwise have the power to suppress or destroy it before it could reach the appropriate authorities. This public forum provides the best protection for the truth. Marcus opened the portfolio and withdrew the first document, a photograph of the letter he had found in Lord Vale's office. He held it high so that everyone in the courtroom could see it, though few could make out the details from their seats. This is a letter written in Queen Isabella's own hand, outlining the benefits that would accrue to her and her son Prince William from the elimination of Prince Alexander. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, fueled by the righteousness of his cause. It discusses the permanent solution to what she termed the Alexander problem. Queen Isabella finally moved, rising slowly to her feet. Her composure was cracking, and Marcus could see the calculation behind her eyes as she weighed her options. This is preposterous, she declared, her voice ringing with indignation. I will not sit here and listen to these slanderous accusations from a disgruntled employee. But King Edmund was staring at Marcus with an expression of dawning horror. Show me the letter, he commanded, his voice hoarse with emotion. Marcus approached the royal section and handed the photograph to his king. As Edmund studied the image, his face went through a series of transformations: confusion, disbelief, recognition, and, finally, a grief so profound it was painful to witness. This is Isabella's handwriting, he said quietly, as if to himself. Then, louder, his voice filling with anguish, this is my wife's handwriting. Lord Vale finally spoke up, his voice smooth and controlled despite the chaos around him. Your Majesty, surely you cannot give credence to these fabricated documents. Anyone can forge a letter, especially someone with access to samples of Her Majesty's writing. Marcus had anticipated this response. He withdrew a second set of photographs showing the hidden compartment in Vale's office, the original documents in their leather folder, and, most damning of all, a series of bank records showing payments to Thomas Bridgman, the huntsman who had been responsible for maintaining Prince Alexander's hunting rifles. These financial records show payments from an account controlled by Lord Vale to Thomas Bridgman in the weeks leading up to Prince Alexander's death, and a final payment of 50,000 crowns immediately afterward. The courtroom erupted again as the implications became clear. Marcus pressed on, raising his voice above the din. Furthermore, I have testimony from Master Gunsmith Robert Fairfax, who examined the rifle that supposedly malfunctioned during the hunting trip. His analysis, which was never included in the official report, concluded that the weapon had been deliberately sabotaged. Judge Morehouse had given up trying to maintain courtroom decorum and was allowing the extraordinary session to continue. The historical significance of the moment was not lost on anyone present. Marcus turned to address Queen Isabella directly. Your Majesty, did you or did you not write the letter discussing the elimination of Prince Alexander? For a long moment, Isabella said nothing. Her face had gone through several transformations of its own, and Marcus could see her mind working furiously to find a way out of the trap closing around her. Finally, she spoke, her voice cold and imperious. I refuse to dignify these accusations with a response. This entire spectacle is nothing more than a pathetic attempt to answer the question. King Edmund's voice thundered through the courtroom, startling everyone present. Marcus had never seen his sovereign so angry, so wounded, so utterly betrayed. Isabella, for the love of God, answer the question. The queen looked at her husband, and, for the first time since Marcus had known her, she appeared genuinely afraid. The mask of regal composure had finally slipped completely, revealing the calculating woman beneath. Edmund, you must understand, she began, her voice taking on a pleading tone, everything I did was for the good of the kingdom. Alexander was unstable, unreliable. He would have been a disaster as king. William is strong, capable. Alexander was my son. Edmund roared, rising to his feet. He was my son, and you killed him. The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. Queen Isabella had not explicitly confessed, but her attempt to justify her actions had revealed enough. The woman who had shared King Edmund's bed for 8 years, who had stood beside him at state functions and charmed foreign dignitaries, had orchestrated the murder of his beloved firstborn son. Marcus felt a wave of profound sadness wash over him as he watched his king's world collapse. But he also felt a sense of justice beginning to emerge from the chaos. Prince Alexander would finally have the truth told about his death. Lord Vale made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Your Majesty, you are distraught and not thinking clearly. These documents could easily have been fabricated. I suggest we adjourn and allow proper authorities to investigate these claims through appropriate channels. But King Edmund was no longer listening to his wife's advisor. He was staring at Isabella with a mixture of horror and disgust that was terrible to behold. How long, he asked quietly. How long have you been planning this? How long have you been lying to me about my son's death? Isabella's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled completely. Perhaps realizing that her position was no longer salvageable, she dropped all pretense of innocence. From the moment I married you, she said with bitter honesty. Did you think I married you for love, Edmund? You were a grieving widower with a kingdom to inherit. Alexander stood between my son and the throne. Everything I did was to secure William's future. The raw cruelty of her words seemed to strike King Edmund like physical blows. He staggered slightly, and Marcus instinctively moved forward, ready to support his sovereign if needed. But Edmund steadied himself and turned to address the stunned courtroom. Guards, he called, his voice heavy with authority and grief, arrest Queen Isabella and Lord Vale for conspiracy to commit murder and treason against the crown. The court erupted into absolute chaos as palace guards moved to comply with the king's command. Isabella finally lost all composure, screaming protests and accusations as she was led away. Lord Vale went quietly, but his face was a mask of cold calculation that suggested he was already planning his defense. Through it all, Marcus remained standing at the center of the storm he had unleashed, wondering if he had done the right thing and knowing that there was no going back now. The days following Marcus's bombshell revelation transformed the kingdom of Eldoria into a cauldron of political turmoil and social upheaval. News of the Queen's arrest spread like wildfire through the capital and beyond, carried by journalists who had witnessed the extraordinary courtroom drama and broadcast to a nation struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the betrayal. King Edmund had retreated to his private chambers immediately after ordering the arrests, refusing to see anyone except his personal physician and Marcus himself. The captain found his sovereign 3 days later sitting in Prince Alexander's former room, surrounded by photographs and mementos of his murdered son. The king had aged years in just those few days, his face gone and his eyes hollow with grief that seemed to have no bottom. "I keep thinking about the signs I missed," Edmund said without looking up as Marcus entered. His voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse from the tears he had shed in private. "The way Isabella would change the subject whenever I spoke about Alexander. How she discouraged me from visiting his grave too often, claiming it wasn't healthy for me to dwell on the past." Marcus stood quietly by the window, allowing his king to process the enormity of what had been revealed. Outside, crowds had gathered in the palace courtyard, some calling for justice, others expressing support for their monarch during his darkest hour. "She used my grief against me," Edmund continued, picking up a photograph of Alexander on his 18th birthday. "Every time I mourned my son, every time I spoke of missing him, she was there with comfort and support, knowing all along that she was the architect of my pain." The investigation that followed Marcus's revelation had moved with unprecedented speed. Special prosecutors, appointed directly by the High Court to ensure independence from royal influence, had been granted extraordinary powers to examine evidence and compel testimony. What they uncovered painted an even darker picture than Marcus's initial accusations had suggested. Thomas Bridgman, the huntsman who had maintained Prince Alexander's rifles, had been found dead in his cottage 2 years after the prince's death, officially ruled a suicide, but now being re-examined as a potential murder designed to eliminate a witness. Bank records revealed a complex web of payments and shell companies that had been used to fund the conspiracy, with money ultimately traceable to Queen Isabella's family fortune. Most disturbing of all, investigators had discovered that Prince Alexander had indeed scheduled a private meeting with his father for the week following his death. The prince's personal secretary, who had been dismissed shortly after the funeral, came forward to testify that Alexander had asked her to prepare a detailed dossier on his stepmother's financial dealings and her influence over royal appointments. He was going to expose her, Marcus had reported to the king during one of their private meetings. Prince Alexander had uncovered evidence of corruption that went far beyond what we initially suspected. Isabella wasn't just eliminating a rival, she was silencing someone who could have brought down her entire network of influence. The revelation that his son had died not just as an innocent victim, but as someone actively fighting against the corruption that had infected his own family, seemed to give King Edmund a measure of purpose amid his grief. He authorized the investigators to expand their inquiry to examine every aspect of Queen Isabella's influence during her marriage to him. What they found was staggering. Isabella and Lord Vale had systematically manipulated royal appointments to place their allies in key positions throughout the government. Lucrative contracts had been awarded to companies connected to Isabella's family. Foreign policy decisions had been influenced by her personal relationships with other royal courts. The conspiracy to murder Prince Alexander was just the most extreme example of a pattern of betrayal that had been going on for years. Public reaction to these revelations was swift and decisive. Crowds gathered daily outside the palace, not in protest against the monarchy, but in support of their king and in demand for justice for Prince Alexander. The young prince had been beloved by the people, seen as a modernizing influence who would have brought progressive reforms to the ancient kingdom. His murder was viewed not just as a personal tragedy for the royal family, but as a theft from the entire nation. Meanwhile, in the Tower of London where she was being held pending trial, Queen Isabella had initially maintained her innocence before gradually shifting to a strategy of justification. Through her lawyers, she leaked statements claiming that her actions had been necessary to prevent Prince Alexander from destroying the monarchy through reckless reforms and scandalous behavior. These character assassinations against the dead prince backfired spectacularly. Former friends, tutors, and associates of Alexander came forward to testify about his character, painting a picture of a young man who had been serious about his royal duties, passionate about social justice, and deeply committed to serving his people. The contrast with Isabella's self-serving machinations could not have been more stark. Lord Vale had taken a different approach, attempting to distance himself from the Queen's actions while acknowledging his role in covering up the crime. His lawyers were arguing that he had been manipulated by Isabella, portrayed as an unwilling accomplice rather than an active conspirator. But the evidence Marcus had uncovered showed clearly that Vale had been a full partner in planning and executing the murder plot. The question of succession had become a pressing issue as well. Prince William, Isabella's son who had been adopted by King Edmund, found himself in an impossible position. At 16, he was old enough to understand the full implications of his mother's actions but young enough to still need guidance and support. The revelation that his path to the throne had been paved with his stepbrother's blood had shattered the young man. King Edmund had summoned William to a private meeting shortly after the arrests, a conversation that Marcus had been asked to witness. The teenager had entered the king's study with obvious trepidation, unsure of how his adoptive father now viewed him in light of his mother's crimes. "William," the king had said gently, "I want you to understand that none of this changes how I feel about you. You are my son in every way that matters, and you bear no responsibility for your mother's actions." The boy had broken down in tears, confessing his own guilt and shame over benefiting from his brother's death, even unknowingly. "I don't deserve to be heir," he had said through his sobs. "Alexander should be here. He should be the one preparing to be king." Edmund had embraced the young man, sharing his grief while also beginning the difficult process of helping him understand his role in healing the kingdom. "We cannot change the past, William, but we can honor Alexander's memory by ensuring that justice is served and by ruling with the integrity he would have shown." The trial was set to begin within the month, with both Isabella and Vale facing charges of murder, treason, and conspiracy against the crown. Legal experts predicted it would be the most significant royal trial in centuries, with implications that would resonate far beyond the borders of Eldoria. International reaction had been swift and generally supportive of King Edmund's handling of the crisis. Foreign monarchs and heads of state had expressed their shock at the revelations while praising the king's commitment to justice even when it meant exposing his own personal betrayal to public scrutiny. But perhaps the most poignant response had come from ordinary citizens of Eldoria. Spontaneous memorials to Prince Alexander had appeared throughout the kingdom, with people leaving flowers, letters, and tokens of remembrance at places associated with the murdered prince. The hunting lodge where he had died had become an unofficial shrine, with a constant stream of visitors coming to pay their respects. Marcus found himself at the center of this outpouring of public sentiment, hailed as a hero by many for his courage in exposing the truth. But the praise sat uneasily with him. He had not acted seeking glory or recognition, he had simply done what his conscience demanded. The knowledge that his revelation had shattered his king's world and plunged the kingdom into crisis weighed heavily on his mind. During quiet moments, usually late at night when he walked the palace corridors on his rounds, Marcus wondered about the path not taken. What if he had remained silent? What if he had allowed the conspiracy to remain buried? King Edmund would still believe his beloved son had died in a tragic accident. The kingdom would remain stable under Isabella's influence. Prince William would eventually ascend to the throne without the shadow of murder hanging over his succession. But, then, he would remember Prince Alexander's face from the portraits that lined the palace halls, and he would think about justice denied and truth buried. Some secrets were too heavy to keep, no matter what the cost of revealing them might be. The young prince deserved to have his story told, even if that story was one of betrayal and murder. As the trial date approached, Marcus prepared himself for what promised to be an ordeal that would test everyone involved. The evidence was clear and damning, but Isabella's defense team was already signaling that they would put the royal family itself on trial, arguing that their client had been driven to desperate measures by the dysfunctional nature of palace politics. The kingdom held its breath, waiting to see how the drama would unfold and what kind of monarchy would emerge from the ashes of betrayal and murder. The only certainty was that nothing would ever be the same again. The Royal Criminal Court had never seen anything like the trial of Queen Isabella and Lord Vale. Security was unprecedented, with armed guards stationed throughout the building and sharpshooters on nearby rooftops. The media presence was overwhelming, with journalists from around the world crowding into the limited public gallery and broadcasting live updates to a global audience fascinated by the downfall of a queen. Marcus sat in the witness section, mentally preparing for what he knew would be the most important testimony of his life. 3 weeks had passed since the arrests, and the investigation had continued to uncover new evidence that painted an even more damning picture of the conspiracy. The prosecution, led by Sir Richard Blackwood, one of the kingdom's most respected criminal barristers, had built what appeared to be an airtight case. Queen Isabella entered the courtroom with her head held high, dressed in a simple black suit that nonetheless managed to convey an air of dignity and defiance. Her legal team, headed by the notorious defense attorney Lady Catherine Roth, had reportedly been paid an astronomical sum to mount her defense. They had already signaled their intention to argue that Isabella had been driven to desperate measures by what they characterized as an abusive and manipulative royal household. Lord Vale, seated separately from his former ally, cut a very different figure. Where Isabella projected defiance, Vale appeared resigned to his fate. His confession to investigators 3 days earlier had sent shockwaves through the case, though the full details were still sealed until his testimony. King Edmund sat in the royal box, looking older and more fragile than Marcus had ever seen him. The past weeks had taken a terrible toll on the monarch, who was not only grieving his son anew but also coming to terms with the scope of his wife's betrayal. Prince William sat beside his adoptive father, his young face etched with a mixture of shame and determination that broke Marcus's heart. Judge Lord Henry Ashford, the Chief Justice of Eldoria, called the court to order with unusual solemnity. At 73, he had presided over many significant cases, but nothing that compared to the magnitude of this trial. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "we are here to examine charges of the utmost gravity against two individuals who held positions of the highest trust in our kingdom. The charges include murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, treason against the crown, and numerous counts of corruption and abuse of power." Sir Richard Blackwood rose to deliver his opening statement, and Marcus was struck by the prosecutor's commanding presence. Tall and silver-haired, with a reputation for methodical preparation and devastating cross-examinations, Blackwood was exactly the kind of advocate Prince Alexander deserved. "Members of the jury," Blackwood began, "over the next several days, you will hear evidence of a conspiracy so shocking, so coldly calculated, that it challenges our basic understanding of human nature. You will learn how Queen Isabella, a woman who swore to love, honor and protect the royal family, systematically planned and executed the murder of Prince Alexander, the rightful heir to the throne of Eldoria. She portrayed Isabella as a woman trapped in a loveless marriage to a man still obsessed with his dead first wife and unable to accept his second family. According to this narrative, Prince Alexander had been an unstable young man whose erratic behavior and growing paranoia had threatened not just his stepmother, but the stability of the entire kingdom. Queen Isabella loved her husband and tried to be a good mother to Prince Alexander, Roth argued, her voice filled with conviction that seemed almost genuine. But she found herself in an impossible situation, caught between a son who was increasingly hostile and suspicious, and a husband who refused to see the danger his heir posed to the monarchy itself. Marcus knew this line of defense had been expected, but hearing Prince Alexander's character assassinated in open court was still difficult to endure. He glanced at King Edmund and saw the monarch's jaw tighten with suppressed rage at the attacks on his beloved son. The first week of testimony focused on establishing the facts of Prince Alexander's death and the subsequent investigation. Marcus took the stand on the third day, walking the jury through his discovery of the evidence and his decision to come forward. Under Sir Richard's careful questioning, he laid out the timeline of events and explained his interpretation of the documents he had found. "Captain Whitmore," the prosecutor asked, "in your 15 years of service to the royal family, had you ever had any reason to question Queen Isabella's loyalty to the crown?" Marcus chose his words carefully. "I had observed certain behaviors that seemed inconsistent with what I believed to be the Queen's public persona. But I attributed these to the normal stresses of royal life until I overheard the conversation in her private study." Lady Catherine Roth's cross-examination was brutal and personal. She questioned Marcus's motives, suggested he had fabricated evidence out of jealousy or a desire for attention, and painted him as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge against his employers. "Isn't it true, Captain Whitmore, that you were passed over for promotion to head of palace security 2 years ago?" she asked with barely concealed disdain. "Yes, that's correct." "And isn't it true that Queen Isabella was instrumental in that decision, preferring to promote someone she felt was more reliable?" Marcus felt his temper flare but kept his voice level. "The Queen expressed concerns about my suitability for the position, yes. But my decision to come forward had nothing to do with personal grievances and everything to do with seeking justice for Prince Alexander. How convenient, Roth replied with obvious skepticism, that your pursuit of justice coincidentally targets the very person who blocked your career advancement. Sir Richard's redirect examination allowed Marcus to explain in detail why he had waited 3 months between discovering the evidence and coming forward, emphasizing his careful investigation and his genuine reluctance to destroy his king's happiness. The prosecution's case continued with devastating effectiveness. Master gunsmith Robert Fairfax testified about his examination of the rifle that had killed Prince Alexander, explaining in technical detail how the weapon had been sabotaged to misfire catastrophically. The courtroom was silent as he described the precise nature of the tampering, work that could only have been done by someone with intimate knowledge of the rifle's mechanism. Banking expert Elizabeth Morrison walked the jury through the complex financial transactions that had been used to pay Thomas Bridgman, the huntsman who had been responsible for maintaining the prince's weapons. The paper trail was meticulous and damning, showing clear connections between accounts controlled by Lord Vale and the payments made to Bridgman before and after the murder. Perhaps most powerfully, Professor Helena Ashford testified about her conversations with Prince Alexander in the weeks before his death. The former royal tutor painted a picture of a young man who was not unstable or paranoid, but rather increasingly concerned about corruption within the palace and determined to protect his father and the kingdom from harmful influences. Prince Alexander came to me because he trusted my judgment and valued my discretion, Professor Ashford testified, her voice thick with emotion. He was not making wild accusations or conspiracy theories. He had discovered specific evidence of financial irregularities and was methodically investigating before bringing his concerns to his father. The defense's strategy became clearer as the trial progressed. Unable to effectively challenge the physical evidence, they focused on character assassination and emotional manipulation. They brought forward witnesses who testified about King Edmund's supposed neglect of his second family, about Isabella's isolation and desperation, and about Prince Alexander's alleged difficult relationship with his stepmother. But their efforts were undermined by Lord Vale's confession, which was read to the court in devastating detail. The former Lord Chancellor had provided a complete account of the conspiracy, from its initial conception to its execution and cover-up. His motivation, he claimed, had been love for Queen Isabella and a genuine belief that Prince Alexander posed a threat to the stability of the monarchy. Queen Isabella convinced me that Prince Alexander was planning to expose what he claimed were irregularities in palace finances, Vale's statement read. She argued that his accusations, whether true or false, would severely damage the monarchy at a time when the kingdom needed stability. She presented the elimination of this threat as a patriotic duty. The confession went on to detail how they had recruited Thomas Bridgman, how they had planned the hunting accident to look like a mechanical failure, and how they had systematically suppressed any evidence that might have led to questions about the official investigation. As the prosecution rested its case, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. The evidence against Queen Isabella and Lord Vale seemed overwhelming, but he knew that juries could be unpredictable, especially when dealing with such emotionally charged material. The defense case was set to begin the following Monday, and Marcus braced himself for what promised to be an even more difficult phase of the trial. Lady Catherine Roth was known for her ability to create reasonable doubt even in seemingly hopeless cases, and Marcus suspected that the worst was yet to come. The final week of the trial brought an intensity that seemed to permeate every corner of the kingdom. Queen Isabella took the stand in her own defense on Monday morning, and her testimony would either save her from the executioner's block or seal her fate forever. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with hundreds more gathered outside listening to radio broadcasts of the proceedings. Isabella wore a deep blue dress that emphasized her dignity and composure as she was sworn in. For the first time since the trial began, she looked directly at King Edmund as she took her oath, and Marcus saw something pass between them, not love, perhaps, but a recognition of shared history that transcended the current circumstances. Under Lady Catherine Roth's careful questioning, Isabella presented herself as a woman who had genuinely tried to serve the crown and protect the kingdom from what she perceived as a genuine threat. Her voice remained steady and controlled as she described her growing concerns about Prince Alexander's behavior in the months before his death. Alexander had become increasingly paranoid and suspicious, she testified, her eyes never leaving the jury. He saw conspiracies everywhere, accused me of manipulating his father, and threatened to make wild accusations that would have damaged the monarchy irreparably. I feared for the stability of the kingdom and for my husband's well-being. She painted a picture of a young man who had been unstable and unpredictable, someone whose claims of corruption were the fantasies of a disturbed mind rather than legitimate concerns about palace operations. According to her testimony, the decision to eliminate Alexander had been made reluctantly, as a last resort to protect the greater good. I never wanted Alexander to die, Isabella said, her voice breaking slightly for the first time. He was my husband's beloved son, and I knew that losing him would cause Edmund terrible pain. But I also knew that if Alexander carried out his threats to make his accusations public, it would destroy the monarchy and plunge the kingdom into chaos. Sir Richard Blackwood's cross-examination was masterful in its restraint. Rather than attacking Isabella directly, he simply walked her through the evidence methodically, asking her to explain each damning document and financial transaction. Her answers became increasingly strained as she struggled to provide innocent explanations for the overwhelming evidence against her. Your Majesty, Blackwood said with deceptive gentleness, you testified that Prince Alexander's concerns about corruption were unfounded paranoia. Can you explain, then, why investigators have discovered irregularities in palace finances totaling more than 2 million crowns that directly benefited your family's business interests? Isabella's composure cracked slightly. Those transactions were legitimate payments for services rendered to the crown. Any suggestion otherwise is simply false. And the payments to Thomas Bridgman? Were those also legitimate payments for services rendered? I was not directly involved in those arrangements. Lord Vale handled such matters on my behalf. Blackwood pressed harder. But, you were aware that Bridgman was being paid to sabotage Prince Alexander's rifle? No, absolutely not. I believed. I was told that Alexander's death would appear to be an accident, but I assumed that meant he would be frightened into silence, not murdered. The contradiction in her testimony was obvious to everyone in the courtroom. If she had not known that Alexander would be killed, why had she written about his elimination in her own hand? The prosecution's rebuttal case was devastating in its simplicity. They called Prince Alexander's personal secretary, who testified about the specific nature of the prince's investigation into palace finances. They presented additional financial records that showed the systematic looting of royal accounts to benefit Isabella's allies. Most damning of all, they played a recording that had been found among Lord Vale's personal effects, a conversation between him and Isabella in which they discussed the logistics of the murder with chilling matter-of-factness. The rifle must misfire completely, Isabella's voice could be heard saying on the crackling recording. It cannot look like sabotage, and there can be no possibility of Alexander surviving the incident. We get only one chance at this, Harrison. The defense's closing argument was an emotional appeal that portrayed Isabella as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, a woman who had made terrible decisions but who had been motivated by genuine concern for the kingdom rather than personal gain. Lady Catherine Roth spoke passionately about the impossible pressures faced by those in positions of royal responsibility and the tragic consequences that could result from even well-intentioned actions. But Sir Richard Blackwood's closing was a masterpiece of legal advocacy that left no doubt about the true nature of Isabella's crimes. He walked the jury through 5 years of systematic deception, showing how the Queen had manipulated her husband's grief while secretly celebrating her son's removal from the line of succession. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Blackwood concluded, his voice ringing with conviction, Queen Isabella would have you believe that she was a reluctant participant in a necessary evil. But the evidence shows us the truth. She was the architect of a cold-blooded murder, motivated not by love of country but by greed, ambition, and a ruthless determination to see her own son on the throne. The jury deliberated for 3 days, during which the kingdom seemed to hold its collective breath. Marcus spent those days walking the palace corridors, trying to process everything that had happened and what it might mean for the future. King Edmund had retreated once again to his private chambers, emerging only to check on Prince William, who was struggling with the public scrutiny and the weight of his complicated inheritance. When the jury finally returned their verdict, the courtroom was so quiet that the sound of their footsteps seemed to echo like thunder. The foreman, a middle-aged shopkeeper named Robert Hayes, stood with obvious nervousness as he prepared to deliver the verdict that would determine the fate of a queen. On the charge of murder in the first degree in the death of Prince Alexander, Hayes announced, his voice barely audible, "We find the defendant, Queen Isabella, guilty." The explosion of noise that followed was immediate and overwhelming. Isabella swayed in the dock as if struck by a physical blow, while Lord Vale, who had already pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for his testimony, simply closed his eyes in resignation. On the charge of treason against the crown, Hayes continued, once order had been restored, "We find the defendant guilty." On the charges of conspiracy and corruption, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. Judge Lord Ashford's sentencing was swift and decisive. Under the ancient laws of Eldoria, the penalty for murdering a member of the royal family was death, and, despite her former status as queen, Isabella would face the ultimate punishment for her crimes. Lord Vale, having cooperated with the investigation, received a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As Isabella was led away, she turned one final time to look at King Edmund. The man she had married, manipulated, and betrayed sat motionless in the royal box, his face a mask of pain and resignation. Their eyes met across the courtroom for just a moment, and Marcus thought he saw something like regret pass between them, not for the crime itself, perhaps, but for the love that had never been real and the trust that had been so thoroughly betrayed. In the weeks that followed, the kingdom began the difficult process of healing and moving forward. King Edmund announced his intention to establish a new foundation in Prince Alexander's memory, dedicated to fighting corruption and promoting transparency in government. Prince William, despite his youth, showed remarkable maturity in handling his complicated position as heir to a throne that had been secured through his mother's crimes. Marcus found himself appointed as head of palace security, a promotion he had neither sought nor desired but accepted out of duty to his king and his kingdom. The scandal had shaken public confidence in the monarchy, but it had also demonstrated the strength of Eldoria's institutions and the power of truth to prevail even against the most powerful conspiracies. The execution of Queen Isabella took place on a grey morning in early autumn, attended by a small group of officials and witnessed by representatives of the press. She maintained her dignity to the end, offering no final confession but expressing regret for the pain her actions had caused to those she had claimed to love. King Edmund did not attend the execution. Instead, he spent that morning at Prince Alexander's grave, finally, able to mourn his son properly now that the truth of his death had been revealed. Marcus accompanied him, standing quietly as his sovereign said goodbye to the young man whose murder had shaken a kingdom and whose memory would forever serve as a reminder of the price of justice. As they walked back toward the palace, King Edmund spoke quietly to his faithful guard. "Do you ever regret it, Marcus? Coming forward with the truth?" Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. The past months had been the most difficult of his life, and he knew that the repercussions of his decision would echo through history. But he also knew that some truths were too important to remain hidden, no matter what the cost might be. "No, Your Majesty," he replied with quiet certainty. Prince Alexander deserved to have his story told. The kingdom deserved to know the truth. And you deserved better than to live the rest of your life believing a lie about your son's death. The king nodded slowly, and together they walked back toward the palace, toward a future that would be built on truth rather than deception, justice rather than conspiracy, and the memory of a young prince whose death had ultimately made his kingdom stronger. The royal guard's secret had been revealed, and, with it, the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Eldoria.